Okay, so what I'm going to do, I have a short presentation. I am going to share my screen. Oh, actually, before I do that, I'm going to introduce myself because 2/3 of you have probably never heard of me before. I'm a medical doctor and a psychiatrist. I live and work in Calgary, Canada. How I got into this field of chronic pain and what I call alphabet diseases, I became ill in 1989. I was in the second year of my residency at that time, and I became unable to work at all. And nobody knew what was wrong. I had fatigue, extremely low stamina, unrefreshing sleep, pretty significant brain fog, a lot of dizziness, like just really inability to do things in an upright position. And back then, that was in 1989, there was just no awareness of these kind of complex, what we now call complex chronic diseases at all. Oh, and I had a lot of pain. I had already had pain since I was about 14. I was an athlete, a soccer player, and I had a kind of a soccer collision and had back pain ever since then. So I had all that going on, and I was a physician already, so I was seeking help through the usual channels, and there really wasn't any help at all. So I stumbled along blindly, making what I now know are all the classic mistakes that my patients make. I recovered to the point where I was able to finish my training. And ever since then, I've worked part-time. So I've had some limitations to my health pretty much for the last 33 years. But as time went on, I was experimenting with what I call self-management. So different things, because the medical system really doesn't have much to offer. So I was experimenting with what I could learn myself. And that led to me moving to Calgary to work with Dr. Bev Tompkins. Some of you may have heard of her. I think she might be retired now, but she was a family doctor here for many years. And she was like one of the few people I knew, for sure one of the few in Canada that knew anything. So I'm very grateful to her. I learned a lot of really practical self-management that helped me improve to the point where I could kind of be a reliable doctor and show up. I then, slowly found tools, and in 2014, I had been really interested in neuroplasticity already for many years, but in 2014, Dr. Deutsch's second book came out. I know in this group, many of you are familiar with Dr. Norman Deutsch, who's written 2 very influential books on neuroplasticity. So his first book came out in 2007, The Brain That Changes Itself, sharing the science of how the brain has this incredible capacity for change, even when we've had conditions for a really long time. But I couldn't figure out how to put it into practice. And then in 2014, late in the year, like December, his second book came out. I immediately read it. And the very first chapter of that book was about a practitioner called Michael Moskowitz, a psychiatrist in San Francisco, who also had chronic pain and figured out some strategies to use neuroplasticity to heal himself. So I immediately bought this manual, which is his manual. I advertised to my patients, asking if I had any volunteers to try this new approach, having no idea if it would help or, would be a total waste of time. And I got 10 people, which is what I need for a small group in my practice. And of those 10 people back in 2015, by the end of 8 sessions over 4 months, because I run my sessions every other week, a bunch of people were miraculously reporting some improvements. And so I was like, wow, maybe there's something to this. I've kept offering the group ever since. So for the last 7 years, I've just turn over groups, like one will finish, the next one will start. So I've had probably, I don't know, 300 people or so go through those groups. And at one point I was actually keeping track. So I had people doing questionnaires before and after, and I did statistics. And again, I was really surprised. I actually had a statistically significant difference, which is what we look for in medical research, between the pre and the post of taking the group. And during that, like, last 7 years, I've been continuing to constantly learn and try to figure out how to implement neuroplasticity in the best possible, most effective, efficient way. There's lots of people out there, as I'm sure many of you are aware, neuroplasticity is like very trendy and bursting all over. But not all approaches are kind of scientifically sound. So I've read tons of papers, tons of books, and then had my the people in my groups kind of as my test subjects, right? To see, well, if we try this, does it work? If we try that, does it work? And so now I'm combining basically what I've learned over the past 7 years of pretty intensive study on neuroplasticity into the course, which I'll talk about at the end if anyone wants to know more about it. What I'm going to present tonight is kind of a summary of what I've learned. So what are the core strategies? I think of it like a flower. You have the core strategies of how to leverage neuroplasticity to rewire the brain. And then you have petals around, I don't know, my biology isn't that good. I don't know what the center of the flower is called, but then you've got the petals around the center, and each petal is an additional, what I'm kind of calling a booster tool, strategies that help the neuroplastic practice work better. And so that is what I'm going to present tonight. So it's going to be very practical, and hopefully it's called neuroplastic transformation. I get that the type is hard to read. So neuroplastic transformation by Dr. Michael Moskowitz. If you, he's retired, so the book is actually becoming a little bit tricky to acquire. I've been trying to encourage him to make it into a PDF or some format that people could, you know, that he could sell easily. But to the best of my knowledge, he hasn't done that. I have some. So if you order it off of Amazon and you live in Canada, it's insanely expensive. It's like $120. I sell them for $60, and we can ship within Canada. If you live in the US or overseas, then it's probably just as easy for you to buy it off Amazon. But if you live in Canada, it's just super pricey. He has a website. It's called neuroplastics.com. Neuroplastics, and with an X at the end. So neuroplastix.com. And on that website, he has a ton of really excellent information and little animations and things to kind of bring the science to life. So it's definitely worth checking out his website. So I'm now going to share my screen. So Healing Through Neuroplasticity is the name of my new course. So this is kind of the logo. If you go to my website, which is also on this slide, and you see that logo, you'll know you're in the right spot. And just a reminder that this is an information session. I'm not providing medical diagnosis or treatment. So the take-home message is that pain is caused by the brain. Now, I know that's hard to believe. It's actually been incredibly hard for me to grasp this, because we all think if I hurt my finger, the pain is coming from the finger. However, what happens actually is we hurt our finger, say I accidentally hit it with a hammer. What's called nociceptive signals travel from the finger to the brain. When those signals get to the brain has a bunch of choices to make. And as I'm going to explain in a few more slides, the brain makes a decision based on its assessment of danger, whether to create pain signals. So the pain signals come from the brain, not from the finger. We know this because of anesthetic. So probably many of you have had some kind of anesthetic, either a local or a general, and you'll know that someone could be cutting you open, and because the brain is turned off by the anesthetic, you don't feel any pain. If it wasn't coming from the brain, an anesthetic wouldn't work. So all pain is caused by the brain. But as you're going to see shortly, acute pain, like I just hit my my finger with the hammer, and chronic pain, something like fibromyalgia, neuropathic pain from diabetes or from herpes, those kind of pains look very different in the brain than the acute pain. So the course that I've developed and what I'm mostly talking to tonight is chronic pain. Chronic pain generally starts with some kind of tissue damage. Someone had an injury, an infection, a surgery, and for some reason, the brain didn't get the memo when the tissues healed. So tissues heal within 8 to 10 weeks, even like you break your femur, your big leg bone, that's one of the or your pelvis, those are the biggest bones to, the slowest bones to heal. Even those big bones heal within 8 to 10 weeks. So if you still have pain after that 8 to 10 weeks, when the tissues are actually healed, that's kind of what I'm talking about tonight, the type of situation where neuroplasticity could be extremely helpful. So the brain senses, when the brain senses danger for whatever reason, and I'm going to talk about some of those reasons, it calls in the reserves. So we have 100 billion neurons in our brain. They do all kinds of different things. And most neurons do more than one thing, but not at the same time. So if the brain is continually sensing danger, whether it's accurate or inaccurate doesn't matter, it's going to tell the neurons to come help the pain processing centers to solve this problem. It wants to get your attention, and one of the ways the brain gets your attention is by creating pain so that you'll pay attention and do something about the problem. And as the pain continues, the pain processing centers get bigger and bigger. So you can actually look at MRI and functional MRI, and they've changed. So this is something very objective and measurable. And they steal resources from the other parts of the brain. This is why when people have chronic pain or persistent pain, they lose the capacity to do other things like sleep well and think clearly. It's because all of the more and more of the resources are being used to try to solve this pain problem, even in the case where there's no tissue damage. And it's like an echo chamber. The brain is going around and around trying to solve a problem that actually doesn't exist, believe it or not. So this is the brain imaging showing you the difference between what acute pain looks like and what chronic pain looks like. So the red ovals, those are acute pain. And I'm not totally sure of the difference between acute and nociceptive. I kind of think of those as very similar. So you can see that the red ovals and the blue triangles are basically overlapping. Then you look at nociplastic pain, which is a fancy new term for chronic pain. And you'll see that the areas of the brain that are processing that chronic pain don't overlap at all with the acute pain. So from the brain's perspective, it's a totally different animal. Now, nociplastic is a term that was coined in, I believe it was 2016, by the IASP the International Association for the Study of Pain. So they're the big, group of scientists in the world who make important decisions about classifying pain and understanding pain disorders. And they made this new category. NOSI means noxious or painful, and plastic refers to neuroplasticity. So the most kind of influential thinkers in the pain world are now saying that chronic pain is due to neuroplasticity. And that's been, that was 6 years ago. So I think this is a very conservative group. And, the research has been out there for decades. They're giving a vote that neuroplasticity involved is kind of a step forward. So how does this happen that the brain could start creating pain when there's no tissue damage? It's because of neuroplasticity. So the first law of neuroplasticity is what fires together wires together. That means that whatever your brain is busy doing, whether it's thoughts, feelings, or actions, it doesn't matter for the brain, they're all equal. More and more synapses are created to facilitate whatever that experience is, the thoughts, the feelings, or the actions. So if the experience is one of pain, more and more neural connections, synapse is the name of when two neurons start communicating with each other, more and more of those synapses are going to form to try to solve the pain problem and communicate it to you to try to solve it. And this is what it looks like. So this is a picture, probably of a dead person, but an actual human brain showing we have all of these neural connections. This is what neuroplasticity is about. The more we use a connection or a pathway, a neural network, the bigger that pathway will become. And if we don't use it, it will eventually get recycled. The synapses will literally break down and all the resources will get recycled and used for other things. So the next concept is that the central nervous system modulates the signals coming from the periphery. So say you hit your finger with the hammer. In this diagram, it's more looking at a knee. So you look at the knee on the left-hand side, which is a nice shiny knee, no arthritis. But maybe something happens, maybe the person hit their knee or hurt it. The signal goes to the spinal cord, which is this thing in the middle. It goes to the brain, and the brain decides whether to amplify, to ramp up that signal, or to actually decrease it. And on the right-hand side, this is not a good-looking knee. This is a knee with a lot of arthritis. You can see the joint space is very narrow. And yet, the person with this knee may have less pain than the person with the perfectly healthy knee because of the brain's capacity to amp up or lower the intensity of the signal. And that the impact of the central nervous system on the signal is up to 100 times. So it can ramp the signal up to be 100 times stronger, or it can calm it down to be 100 times less strong. It has a lot of leeway, which is fabulous because we're sentient beings and we can influence our brain. So the fact that the brain has this much capacity to change the signal is actually fabulous news for us who maybe want to change things about our experience. So just to kind of drive this point home about the brain's ability to modulate pain, here's two different examples. One example is phantom limb pain. 75% of people who have lost a limb, a digit, a limb, a body part, for whatever reason, experience severe pain, what's called phantom pain. So much so that these people are often at risk of suicide because the pain is so unrelenting. And yet, the body part doesn't exist. So this is like the most extreme example. There is no tissue damage because the part is long gone, and yet it can cause excruciating pain. My take on this is that if the brain isn't getting accurate information from the body, it makes it up and it fears the worst. Our brain has a negativity bias. It wants to save us. And I think in the case of missing information, it kind of fills in the rest. The opposite example is an athlete. I'm sure this may have happened to many of you, or you know of cases from professional sports that you've watched, where an athlete has a severe injury, and yet they keep playing despite that. They don't even realize they've broken their arm or pulled it out of their socket or whatever until the game is over. And they're like, oh my gosh. And again, the brain in this case may have gotten the messages from the injured body part, but it said, no, it's not that bad. It's okay. It's more important to finish the game. So these are two extreme examples to kind of indicate that the brain can be misinformed and can be pumping out signals that are inaccurate. So the take-home message of what I've shared so far is that neuroplasticity is both the cause and the cure for chronic pain. So now this next part I'm going to talk about is actually what to do. So this is probably the most important part of the presentation. This exact information comes from a really great podcast by Andrew Huberman, Huberman. His podcast is called the Huberman Lab Podcast. He's a neuroscientist at Stanford, and I'm pretty sure some of you in this group are aware of him. He's been running a weekly podcast since January 2021, and the very first topic he covered was neuroplasticity. So the first 5 podcasts, all of which are like an hour and a half or more long, so there's a ton of information, is all about the science of neuroplasticity. Whoops. So what he shared, these are kind of the 5 steps of putting neuroplasticity into action for you. The first step is to optimize alertness. So what this refers to is if you're very sleepy, you can't really do things effectively. Your brain is kind of on doze mode. If you're too wired, like you're very stressed and wired, neuroplasticity also doesn't work optimally. So the first step, if you're trying to do neuroplastic practice, is to be rested enough that you're alert, but not wired. So maybe do some calming activity like breathing, for example, before you start the practice so that you're kind of in that sweet spot. The second step is to focus your attention on the thing you want to accomplish or learn. The brain hardwires everything that happens, but not all experiences are equal in the brain's perception. So the thing that I'm paying most attention to, when I focus my attention, it's like a yellow highlighter. Everything that happens to us during the day gets stored in the hippocampi, which are like on the 2 sides of our brain in the temporal lobes. But if we don't move it at night to long-term storage, which is in the middle of the cortex, it will be forgotten. So not everything gets hardwired. The things we pay attention to that get yellow highlighted when we rest or sleep, and the information gets moved from the hippocampus to the cortex, the things that are highlighted due to our focus are the things that are going to get hardwired. And that, I call that the long-term storage. So when you're doing practice, you have to be paying attention. This is why distraction is ineffective. So I'm going to talk about that in a minute, the difference between distraction and active redirection. Active redirection means you're paying attention to the activity you're doing. Once you're paying attention, you need to practice the new skill, and I'm going to describe right after this what an example of that skill would be in terms of someone who's trying to heal from chronic pain. Dr. Huberman recommends practicing the skill for up to 20 minutes, but not much longer because it's hard to pay attention longer than 20 minutes. So little short bursts may be more effective than long periods of practice. Then inevitably you're going to make mistakes. Celebrate those because mistakes make the brain pay attention. Say you're trying to learn a new physical skill. You're trying to get the ball in the net or the puck in the net or something like that, and you keep missing. That actually wakes up your brain to be in active kind of solution mode to try to figure out what the problem is so that you can correct it and improve your skill. So if you practice something and it doesn't go easily, no problem. That's actually good. That's alerting your brain. And then after you do the practice, you want to rest and recover because especially the sleep that following night, like the sleep you get tonight is going to help you hardwire the experiences that you had today. So the skill that Dr. Moskowitz recommends that seems to be really successful for many people, I call active redirection. This means every time you notice pain, and for some people with unrelenting severe pain, it's almost always, it's an opportunity to change your brain. That means you, on purpose, shift the focus of your attention from the pain and the misery associated with the pain. So most people with chronic pain, when they notice pain, they have certain thoughts and emotions, things like, I can't deal with this. This can't go on. This is getting worse. My life is ruined. I'm depressed. I'm losing hope. All of these are super common with chronic pain. You want to shift the focus of your attention from those habitual patterns, which you've probably hardwired well because they've been practiced sometimes for years or decades, to an activity that you enjoy. Otherwise, you're not going to do it. That's incompatible with pain. Pain, I think I have a slide at the very end. The centers of the brain that process pain also process mood, but the valence is opposite. The neurotransmitters are different. So if you are in a good mood, you will have less pain. That's just how the brain works. If you have less pain, you'll be in a better mood. It's kind of like a seesaw. So anything you do that elevates your mood, I call it things like that makes you feel happy, happiness, love, connection, meaning, joy, things like that, are automatically going to make pain less. And it has to be something that takes your full attention. And I think I have a slide. Yes. And why does this work at a biological level? It's because a neuron can't do two things at once. So the brain areas that process pain also perform other functions. If you occupy those neurons with the other functions, they can't process pain. It's that simple. That's just how neurons work. So every time you notice pain, it's like the image in this slide, you have a choice. You can think and act out your typical pain responses, which are totally understandable and reasonable given the situation. But the problem is they're just going to reinforce the pain at a biological level. Or you can shift the focus of your attention to something else. And here's some examples of the something else from Dr. Moskowitz's research. Calming sense, he's especially keen on peppermint oil. It's a strong smell, it's a bit activating, and it actually decreases substance P, which is a pain neurotransmitter. So it actually has a biological effect. Many people in the neuroplasticity coaching field use visualizing, and some suggestions or examples. You could picture the brain on pain, meaning imagining it's all lit up on fire. And then you could picture a little fire hoses, shooting water onto those pain areas and cooling down the brain. Notice that you're cooling the brain down, not the body, because pain is produced by the brain, not by the body. So you're actually wanting to visualize the brain becoming calmer. Self-talk can be helpful, reminding your brain that it's misinterpreting, that there isn't any tissue damage, and that you would rather focus on something else. Soft touch is very calming. A smooth rock, a soft blanket. For those who can do it, exercise or mindful movement has a very significant effect. So exercise, of all the things you can do, probably has the strongest anti-pain effect. Any of you who used to be athletes, maybe before you became afflicted with pain, will know the endorphin high, right? That we all love and strive for. This is how it works. You do an activity that increases and releases endorphins, which are like natural opiates in our brain, and that decreases pain. It's why you can be doing a sport or an activity and not notice at first that you've pulled something or become injured. And lastly, surprisingly, empathy. We have these things called mirror neurons, and if you activate them by maybe talking to a friend who's struggling, you're focusing your attention and you're lighting up your mirror neurons, and apparently that decreases pain. So these are just a few of many, many possible things you could do each time you notice pain. So the last part of my presentation is on what I'm calling neuroplasticity boosters. These are the additional things you can do to help augment or increase the effectiveness of that core strategy, which I've just described, of active redirection. So I'm going to go through each of them briefly, and then we'll open it to questions. So the first one is building safety. At the very beginning, I mentioned that the brain decides whether to produce pain signals or not based on its overall assessment of whether you're in danger. This concept of DIMS and SIMS comes from the NOI group in Australia. Again, some of you, I'm sure, are quite knowledgeable. David Butler and Lorimer Moseley are the two most prominent people of that group. They're both neuroscience researchers and educators. If you want to learn more, you can search out videos of them online. There's a very famous TEDx talk by Lorimer Moseley, which is hilarious and explains some of what I'm explaining, but in a much more engaging manner. So they have a whole book called The Protectometer, which explains this concept of danger and safety and how you can leverage that to improve your pain situation. So danger in me, DIMS, refers to experiences that in your personal experience are associated with danger. It may be totally different for someone else. These are very individual. DIMS, when they occur, increase pain perception. So they have a biologic effect. SIMS, alternatively, are things that you associate with safety. It might be, for example, certain people, certain smells, certain places, certain experiences. And again, it's from your individual experience. And when you remember or experience SIMS, the pain settles because the brain thinks you're safe. And so that's the message here, that they actually have a physiological impact. It's not just psychology. And the beauty of this is you can design your day to increase the number of SIMS, the number of experiences you have that help you feel safe, and to decrease the number of DIMS. And here are some examples. So all of the sensory information that you experience may, if you pay attention, you'll go, does that, say if you smell burning, that's immediately for most people going to increase, oh my gosh, there could be danger. But if you smell rising bread or coffee, it might help you feel safe. Certain tastes, like your favorite food, might help you feel safe, whereas a different taste, something that's bitter or a food that you don't like or that reminds you of traumatic childhood experiences of being forced to eat a food you didn't like, for example, they might make you feel in danger. Self-talk is incredibly important. I think I have a whole slide on that. So things you say out loud and things you think to yourself, mindset. If you have the strong belief that there's nothing you can do about your chronic pain, it will make the benefits of practice less, because the beliefs interact with the biology and can either augment and like increase the effectiveness of what you're doing or take away from it. If I think back, to so many hundreds of people I've worked with in this capacity, it's a way in which people kind of shoot themselves in the foot. They do the practice, right? So some people are very devoted and kind of motivated, but they keep this belief that it's not going to work. And that decreases the effectiveness in my observation. Places you go. So here's an example of individuality. Say you have a doctor or say a pain therapist, a chiropractor, or a physio that you really like. And whenever you go to that person, you feel understood and helped, and you leave the office feeling emotionally and physically better than when you went in. That appointment for you is going to be a sim, because you feel less alone. You feel like you have resources. Another person who has a less rosy relationship, say their doctor doesn't understand and makes stupid suggestions. Sometimes doctors do this. For you, that appointment may be a dim. You're like dreading that appointment because you're expecting to be invalidated and not helped. So it's just an example how whether something is a dim or a sim depends on your life experience. People in your life are really important. Most neuroplasticity-based programs recommend that you have a conversation with the important people in your life and let them know that from now on, you don't want every conversation to start with, how are you, right? With that concerned look, like how much pain are you in today? That you actually want your relationship to be based on things other than pain, maybe similar movie interests, book interests, music, social, politics. You want your relationships to be focused on things that are indicative of your whole self. When people have chronic pain, I did some surveys before I developed my course to kind of get people's opinions on what was of interest to them and their pain experience. And they said pain was their full-time job. It was so severe that everything they did in the day was based on, was this going to flare their pain or not? We want to get away from that, because if everything in your life has some kind of pain connection, it means that your brain is creating more and more synapses and neural connections that are pain related. And you want to do the opposite. You want more and more of your life to be things you enjoy or that are meaningful to you, and less of the airtime to be taken up by pain. Another neuroplastic booster is calming the autonomic nervous system. There's many, many ways to do this. I'm just going to briefly mention 3: paced breathing, meditation, and ice baths. I think I have a slide on paced breathing. Yes, so I'll just talk about meditation. There's an enormous scientific literature on meditation, really proving, including functional MRI studies that prove neuroplasticity, because you can teach a new person who's never meditated before to meditate an hour a day for 2 weeks, and you can measure changes in the brain in that little of a time. You're right, I should mention, so the neuroplasticity happens quickly. So although sometimes the neuroplastic practice takes a really long time, I've got a slide on that at the end about the timing. Sometimes changes can happen incredibly fast. There's several studies that show that in as little as 10 hours of learning a new skill, there's measurable changes in neural pathways. So we can use that to our advantage. Ice baths, oh my goodness. So how does this work? I myself have not tried it, okay, full disclosure. You take an ice bath, meaning you take a bath of cold water in which you've put like a few trays of ice cubes. As soon as you get into that bath, what does your body do? You go, oh my God, right? It's involuntary. Your sympathetic fight or flight, your eyes open, you're like on full alert. This is the perfect opportunity to practice calming, to practice continually. Some people do it every single day, to practice calming the autonomic nervous system in the face of an intentional stress. And if you do this with an intentional stress, it means that when you have unintentional stresses in your life, you're going to be much better at handling them and keeping your nervous system calm. When the nervous system is calm, neuroplasticity works better. One of the most accessible strategies for calming the nervous system is paced breathing. So this is just one example. I call it the 4-7-8. So you breathe in for 4, you hold for 7, and you breathe out for 8. If you want to see a video demo, you can go to Dr. Andrew Weil's website, and he's a big promoter of this particular breathing. Exercise. So I'm very aware that not all of you can exercise. For many people with chronic pain, exercise has decreased because of the worry or the experience that it causes a flare. Just to say, though, from a biological perspective, exercise may be helpful. So I think I have a slide on how to approach it. So if we look at evolution, scientists believe that our ancestors whose brains could think quickly while running were the ones that survived, right? So being able to run fast is an adaptive skill. Animals who exercise more grow bigger and complex brains. These are in laboratory, like controlled laboratory experiments where they have a group of mice that are just sitting around, the equivalent of mouse Netflix, and another group of mice who have little running wheels and toys in their cage that are encouraging them to be more active. And the mice in the enriched cages have bigger brains. And interestingly, animals like koalas, who I had the privilege of seeing one time in Australia, it was so cool, very exciting experience, but they don't move very much. They're just like lazing around in the trees. Apparently over evolution, their brains have gotten progressively smaller. So for people who can't really do vigorous exercise because of pain, and I'll say who can't do it yet, because I think for all of us, one of the goals is to progress so that we increasingly can do exercise. A starting point might be what I call mindful movement. This is slow, gentle movement, which will not injure tissues. Again, the brain may have the misperception that even gentle movement causes pain. I have a very close friend who has extremely severe pain, and it's been like a real process for her to rewire her brain to realize that moving is actually not causing damage. The brain is misperceiving the signals. So things like restorative yoga, Tai Chi, Feldenkrais, Pilates, and Nat Banyel, these are good starting points for many people. The trick is to find something that you enjoy. Otherwise, you're probably not going to do it sustainably. So much for the half-hour presentation, right? I'm at 7:49. Well, I'm at 49 after the hour. For people who are starting at a very low level of function because of very severe pain, the good news is that you can imagine movement as a starting point before you actually do it. So the recommendation is to construct a hierarchy, beginning with imagining movements or watching other people do movements on YouTube, something like that. So you're not actually moving yourself, but you're imagining it or watching others do it. that activates the same neurons in your brain that would be active if you were doing the movement. It activates them about 80% of the full amount. So that's pretty close. So what that means is if you imagine or watch easy movements, things that look very pleasurable, slow, gentle, smooth movement, you can rebuild your capacity. Your movement neurons will get fired in a gentle, controlled way, and your brain will get more comfortable with that. Then you could move up to imagining or watching movements that are just on the edge of your comfort zone, maybe moving a little bit faster or with weight involved or a little bit of a jerky movement. And then finally move into imagining or watching movements that are currently outside of your capacity. And there's it's called graded motor imagery. So like it's a whole practice that's now becoming very popular worldwide. Again, a lot of it comes out of the NOI group in Australia, that over time, you're going to slowly regain the capacity to do those movements without causing a flare. I'm almost at the end. I think I have 1 or 2 more slides. Belief, I've already mentioned, is surprisingly impactful. And here's the evidence. There's a psychology researcher called Alia Crum, C-R-U-M, Alia, A-L-I-A, and she did a podcast with Dr. Huberman that was very impactful for me. I had heard of these studies, but I couldn't talk about them because I didn't know who did them and I hadn't read the papers. And I try to never present something that I can't actually back up with research. So when I listened to that podcast and I realized she's the one who did these brilliant studies, now I can talk about them. So here's just one example. She's done several of these. It's called the milkshake study. Participants were given identical milkshakes on 2 separate occasions. So each person got 2 milkshakes on separate days. On one occasion, they were told that the milkshake was a healthy, low-calorie shake full of good nutrients. Yum, right? And maybe it was green, I'm not sure. On the second occasion, they were given the exact same milkshake. They were told it was an indulgent, fatty, high-calorie kind of treat milkshake. They then measured a hormone called ghrelin, G-H-R-E-L-I-N, which is the hormone produced when people are hungry. We have no control over ghrelin, suffice to say, right? It's a totally unconscious process based on what we consume. So if someone's just eaten a big meal or an indulgent milkshake, we expect the ghrelin level to be low. But if we haven't eaten, or we've eaten the low-calorie healthy milkshake, we would expect the ghrelin level to be high. And that's exactly what happened, even though the milkshake in actual fact was identical both times. So the mindset, what the person was told and believed about the milkshake, even though it wasn't true, had a physiologic effect at an unconscious level. So in terms of eating behavior, this is really important. It gives a clue. If someone's struggling with overeating and they're trying to diet, what's going to happen? They're going to constantly feel deprived and their ghrelin levels are going to go up because of their mindset that they're not getting enough food. But if, on the other hand, they believe that the food they're eating is sufficient and healthy and satisfying, maybe their ghrelin won't be as high and they won't be as hungry. I believe this is the last slide. So mood and pain. I've mentioned this before. This is the diagram showing the actual brain centers that process both mood and pain. The neurotransmitters, serotonin, norepinephrine, substance P, GABA, process pain, and they process depression and anxiety, but in opposite directions. So again, anything you can do to improve your mood is going to boost the effectiveness of your neuroplastic practice. If you're very anxious and very depressed, the practice will not be as effective. Oh, right. I've got, I think, a couple slides just to answer some of the frequently asked questions. So frequently asked question number 1, what type of pain will respond? And the answer is, I put almost. David Butler and Lorimer Mosley say 100% of chronic pain will respond. They don't pull any punches, and they're the researchers. I put almost because I'm a little bit cautious and conservative by nature. But basically, any type of chronic pain, fibromyalgia pain, phantom limb pain, migraine pain, neuropathic pain, irritable bowel syndrome, arthritis. So you'll notice in this list something like arthritis, where there obviously is tissue damage, right? You can do an x-ray, the scraggly knee that's like got spicules causing pain. Even in this case where there is tissue damage, because pain is created by the brain, if you work on the brain, and basically this practice is to help you turn down the volume on pain processing, the nociceptive signals coming from, say, the arthritis will trigger less pain because your brain will be calm and you've taught it that it's not a world emergency. The other slide is on the timeline, so I've kind of hinted at this. What I've learned over time from, observing and getting feedback from the people I work with is that in as little as 4 weeks of daily practice, people start developing the ability to turn down the pain in the moment while they're practicing. Then as soon as they stop practicing and they go back to their regular activities, the pain tends to recur. With continued practice at about the 8 to 12 week mark, people start noticing what I call a residual effect or a tail. They maybe do a minute or 2 or 5 or even 10 minutes of practice. They get the pain down, they go back to their usual activity, and they have a residual effect. So the practice is now, that tells you that neuroplasticity is happening, and those brain circuits are remaining active even after you've gone back to your usual activities. Then at somewhere between 12 and 24 weeks, again, for people who have done regular daily practice, what I call unplanned effect happens. So an example of this, it was so marked to me. I was in a group. I always start my groups with, how have you been doing? What successes have you had? And one participant said, I watched a movie with my husband last night, a 2-hour movie. And it wasn't until the movie finished that I realized I had been sitting there for 2 hours without pain. So she didn't do any practice. She wasn't even thinking about pain. And after the fact, she realized the pain had been considerably less. She said she hadn't watched a movie in years, like just sitting still for that long was excruciating. So that's what I call the unplanned effect. That's evidence that neuroplasticity, your default settings are being changed. And by 6 months of consistent practice, most people experience less overall pain. What I notice for myself, I do neuroplastic practice for a number of symptoms, and it's a lifestyle. So I say to people, even after you've had considerable benefit, I strongly recommend that you continue the practice whenever you notice pain or whatever symptom it is you're trying to work on, so that it keeps getting stronger and stronger. Because if you go back to the previous old habits, the pain will come back because the brain is plastic, right? You can train it, but then if you go back to the old patterns, it will, say, relapse. I believe this is my last slide. So what are some tips? Daily practice is really important. This takes quite a bit of discipline. It's not easy. The practice itself is easy, but remembering to do it when you're in pain is quite difficult. The people that do well change their inner and outer dialogue. They change their beliefs. They buy into the science that it is fully possible to become pain-free, and they work towards it. And they don't spend a lot of time thinking and talking about pain and pain-related behavior. They commit to do something different each time they notice pain, and they do whatever it takes. So the most successful people I've worked with literally said, I'm in excruciating pain now. I can't do anything. I have nothing to lose. I'm going to spend the next year of my life dedicated to this practice. And those people have done incredibly well. One of my early success stories was a woman in her 70s. She had had pain for decades. She was in a wheelchair. Her husband brought her to the first group in a wheelchair. And by the end of about 6 months, she was slowly getting her life back. She was walking walking from the parking area into the room. Obviously, this is before COVID. She regained her career as a painter. And last year, in her late 70s, she had 9 curated art shows. Unbelievable. She hadn't done art in years, right? Because it was just excruciating. She couldn't think, she couldn't create. I had a much more recent example. I gave a much briefer version of this information in one of my groups. And then I just took 8 weeks off. I just came back to work last week. And one of the people in that group had basically taken that very basic information about active redirection and started practicing it every day. And her quote to me last week was, I now have a handle on my pain. I was amazed because I really hadn't given her that much information, right? She just started doing it. So in conclusion, chronic pain is caused by the brain and it can be healed in a very substantial way. It takes about an hour a day. Most teachers in the field say, and you don't have to do it all at once, these little spurts each time you notice pain, I think are more effective than saying doing an hour meditation in the morning. A meditation morning and evening is helpful to calm the nervous system, but I think it's equally as helpful each time you notice pain to take action. And all types of pain and all durations of pain and all severity of pain can respond. So I'm going to open it up to questions and stop my sharing. I see that there are a lot of things in the chat. So I don't know, Michael, if you've been looking at the chat and if there are questions in there or it's more comments.
Kind of a little bit of both. I think there are some very valid questions.
Have you looked at them? Do you want to maybe run them by me and then we'll open mics?
So one of them that I paid attention to was after you talked about the breathing.
Okay.
And he said, I've always heard with breathing to avoid the hold part, because if you have trauma, it can trigger fears of dying, etc., and bring up old stuff. Is that correct? Can that cause more panic and not calm?
That's really interesting. I haven't actually heard that. I definitely know that people with anxiety, paced breathing can be a challenge. And I think anybody with trauma, the trauma can attach itself to any experience. So that definitely sounds valid to me. And I would say, I wouldn't preclude paced breathing just because you've had trauma. But if you've had trauma and you try paced breathing and it brings up fear, then my recommendation would be maybe to seek out a person who has skill in breathing. Like that's a whole field, right? And some people spend their whole lives and careers learning the ins and outs of healthy breathing, and maybe see if you could find someone to guide you. Because breathing is I said exercise was the most effective. We'll say maybe breathing is up there. So exercise and breathing are the top 2 strategies for calming the system. And a calm system, neuroplasticity works much better than a stress system. So finding some way, like breathing activates the vagus nerve, which, again, has biological effects. Finding some way to tap into that would be really helpful.
Okay.
Can I respond to that question too?
Oh, sure.
Trauma and the belief of holding your breath, that's just really tying into beliefs for a lot of the part. So it's similar to the pain. It's how you do your thinking, how you think about it. Because you could take the example of many people with trauma could hold their breath, and that could be quite calming and pleasing.
Okay.
So it's a lot to do with how you're thinking about it. It can be.
But if you have, so all of this neuroplasticity, we call it unconscious conditioning. Like, actually, that's a really good point I didn't bring up before. All of this is unconscious. So if you have chronic pain, it's absolutely not your fault. All of this is happening in your brain without your awareness. Now that you realize you have an impact, now you can bring like your conscious intentions to bear. You can leverage it to your advantage rather than having it work against you. So once unconscious conditioning has occurred, maybe for an example would be pairing breath holding with anxiety or pairing a certain activity with pain, it does take a little bit of time to rewire those pathways. So it's not, it's absolutely possible, but it takes a little bit of work. And for people with very severe trauma, having some expert guidance may be helpful. Yes. So I see one question, sorry. Would a copy of the slideshow? So we are recording this. I'm going to put a copy on my webpage. And yes, I would be very happy to post the slides with it. So Michael is my tech guru. So that would be possible, right, Michael?
Yes, ma'am. I already told them we would do that. I just
Okay,
wasn't sure where.
Okay.
So another question, Ellie, that I thought was good. If somebody is on morphine and other pain meds, what's the impact of that with neuroplasticity or vice versa?
That is such a good question. So Lorimer Moseley is an eloquent speaker about the physiology that can happen with opiates, that they can actually make the pain processing sensitivity greater. So they can act over time, they can backfire. When you take opiates at first, the acute effect, they're incredibly effective, right? They're used during and after surgery where you've got like body parts hanging open. But over time, and I don't think it happens in everyone, but there's definitely the possibility that they actually contribute to the sensitization of pain processing. What I recommend to people is that when you start practicing neuroplastic strategies, you don't change anything in terms of your medications. You're on them for a reason. Your body feels comfortable on them. As so many people in my groups will come in, with progress reports, usually after a few months, this isn't right away, where they're saying, you know what, I was able to lower the dose of some of my pain meds. My belief is it's going to work better if you practice first, you start ramping down the volume on pain processing, and then it just will become apparent to you that you don't need as high a dose. To me, that's more effective than feeling some kind of internal pressure, because there's all these messages in society now that pain meds, especially opiates, are bad and you shouldn't be on them. I disagree. I feel that if you try to go off them before you're ready, now you're going to be causing a bit of a crisis. Your brain's going to sense danger and it's going to ramp the pain back up. But I have many patients who have totally come off their meds. So that's a great question.
Another one has to do with something that isn't pain specific. You've spoke tonight about pain mostly, but this other person says, what I've learned about neuroplasticity is via work I've done for my post-concussion symptoms, but I do have brain fog, dizziness, heavy brain nausea. Does neuroplasticity, can that help me with those issues as well?
So that's a really great question here. And this is like my opinion, right? So everything I talked about in the presentation is very science-based. Now we're getting kind of into opinion. So for people that have traumatic brain injury, there's actually damage to the brain, right? There's trauma and inflammation to the brain. which is causing those symptoms of disequilibrium and brain fog. And also a lot of people with traumatic brain injury have a lot of sensitivity, like to smell and taste and sound and light. I think sometimes what happens with traumatic brain injury, just like with pain, there's the initial trigger of the head injury and the tissue damage. For some people, the recovery is prolonged, and that prolongation of recovery may have something to do with neuroplasticity, that the brain is sensing danger and gets into that feedback loop or echo chamber, and neuroplasticity can prolong the symptoms. For that case where recovery is taking longer than it should, for, I'm sure there's charts on, how long it takes the brain to heal from injuries, then I think neuroplastic practice could be extremely helpful. So for any symptom in which the brain may be playing a role in augmenting the symptom, this practice could be helpful. For example, there are programs which successfully use similar strategies for things like chemical and sensory sensitivity, so where the brains become very sensitive, and also even for things like MECFS and postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. So I think any symptom caused by the body it's possible for almost any symptom to be augmented or sensitized in the brain. And in those cases, a neuroplastic practice could help. I would say it certainly couldn't hurt. Like for me, I plan to do this for the rest of my life because I started targeting certain symptoms. It took me a really long time. I'm not the most diligent practicer daily, so I'm a little bit slower on the path. But what's been really exciting is some symptoms I didn't even target or I didn't even know could change have shifted. And so that tells me that there's some generalization. As we convince our brain that we are safe, it turns down the volume on many symptoms, not only the one that we're targeting. So many people in my pain groups, of course, they were all targeting pain because that was the explicit goal. But many of them have reported that their mood has really improved, and they weren't even targeting that.
So another question here, Ellie.
Okay.
I think you're going to just be able to pounce on these. There's been a couple of people
Okay.
that said neuroplasticity, chronic fatigue syndrome. I can't think of a better person to answer that question than you.
So there
Can
is
it apply to changing the fatigue?
Yeah, this is a really tough question. And again, it's my opinion. And I think it depends a little bit. So the research in MECFS, and I just finished watching the international conference. It was just held in late July. The research is pretty clear that the biology of MECFS has to do with not enough cellular energy, not enough ATP. So for whatever reason, the mitochondria, we don't think they're broken, but we think they're not functioning at full capacity. So I think to myself, well, in this case, is it possible that a neuroplastic practice could change that? Because the problem is not only in the brain, it's in all the cells of the body. Nevertheless, there's a program, a neuroplasticity program called the Gupta program, Gupta. He is a man who had MECFS for 7 years and then recovered and then created this program to help others. And many people have taken his program and have had improvements in fatigue. So I think it's possible. I think what may happen is that it's both peripheral and central, meaning there's not enough ATP in the cells. But if the brain gets the message of danger and keeps replaying that danger signal over and over, the peripheral fatigue that we can measure with mitochondrial studies can be augmented by what we call central fatigue. I actually did a research study, like it was way back in 2004 at the University of Calgary, and we measured that. I was totally shocked by the results because it showed that central fatigue played a role. And I was not expecting that. And I was like all cranky. They were even looking for it. So I've remembered those results, and that really ties in that neuroplasticity could help if central fatigue is part of the problem.
One of the attendees tonight has just said she has significantly reduced her CFS symptoms with neuroplasticity. So there's
Cool.
an example. Yeah. And kind of related to what you were already saying, another person had specifically asked the limbic system training like DNRS or the Gupta programs, are those the same or are those different?
They're similar but different. So both of them are versions of the original program, which is called the lightning process, which is primarily taught in the UK and in Europe. The lightning process is quite problematic in many ways. So some people like Annie Hopper, who developed DNRS, and Ashok Gupta, who developed the Gupta program, I think took the good parts of the lightning process and left some of the problematic aspects behind. What I would say to compare the two, DNRS is a fairly rigid, repetitive regime of practice. For some people who need something very specific and like to be told exactly what to do, that could be super appealing. For some people who do better with maybe a more gentle, flexible approach, the Gupta program may be a better fit. So I have patients who have taken one or the other or both. I've done both, so I have pretty good awareness of both of them. My program, my Healing Through Neuroplasticity, I call it a smorgasbord. So most of the other programs out there, including DNRS and Gupta, are fairly structured, and they kind of teach everybody to do the same thing. My experience running groups for like 7 years is that everybody's different. And just like the question about breath work, some people love breath work and some people struggle with it. So in my program, I call it a smorgasbord. I have a ton of different types of tools, hoping that people who try everything will figure out which tools work the best for them.
Thank you. And then Jackie said, is there research about using concepts like active redirection for feelings of chronic fatigue caused by autoimmune disease?
Now I'm way out there into opinion land. So I would say absolutely not. So the question is there research? The answer is for sure no. There's actually very little research on neuroplasticity approaches. So the Gupta program has 3 small studies showing some effectiveness. DNRS does not yet have any research. There's, I have a blog on my website called something, it has low back pain in the title. And it's a review of a study that came out within the past year that using a neuroplasticity-based approach helped people with low back pain. And the results were measured by functional MRI. So I did a blog on that study because it's really the first major study to use functional MRI to show it's not just people's opinions maybe that they're getting better because they're trying to please the researcher, that there's actually objective evidence. I'm involved in a research team. It's a collaboration between the University of Calgary, University of Alberta, University of Toronto, and McMaster University. And we haven't yet started because the funding, we've been told we got the funding, but they haven't actually given us the money. So as soon as that funding becomes available to us, we're going to be doing also a formal study. So I'm sure there's many studies out there because this is kind of an emerging field, but the specifics like which type of people respond better, which techniques are the best, we don't know that yet.
Fair enough. This one you've kind of addressed in your talk, but it came up, so we'll just hit it again.
Okay.
And I'm kind of paraphrasing as I'm reading this, that our intuition, what we're taught is that when there's pain in the body, it means something's wrong and it's telling us to pay
Exactly.
attention to it. So she's saying, isn't that what we're supposed to do, is pay attention to it?
That is the excellent question. Thank you for asking us it. So in acute pain, absolutely true. You put your finger by accident on the hot stove, you get immediate feedback, which prompts you to move your hand, right? The pain is the warning the brain sends you to do something right away. In chronic pain, it isn't the same. You saw the picture, and the pain processing centers on functional MRI in acute pain and chronic pain are totally different. In chronic pain, the brain thinks there's a problem, but there actually is not. And or the brain thinks there's a big problem when there's actually a little problem. So in chronic pain, the brain is sending out inaccurate messages.
Fair enough. There's more questions here, Ellie. You tell me when you're ready to.
Well, we
it
can
quits.
go, how about another 10 minutes? I see one question I'd love to address. It came to me directly. How can we get in touch with you? So the bad news is I just posted a blog on my website 2 weeks ago that I am retiring. So I am no longer taking patients. All of my groups are closed. And I am continuing my online education. And the reason I've made that decision is because that can reach more people. My medical practice, I can only work with people in Alberta, and these are huge problems that affect people all over the world. So the way that you can connect with me is through my website, and I've got lots of ideas for the new year on different options, but I'm not going to really announce those yet, because first I'm going to retire. Then I'm going to go to Antarctica for 4 weeks in January and February and kind of decompress. And then when I come back, I've got some ideas about some ongoing online education and support with me personally, in addition to the classes that I run. So anybody here who wants to kind of be aware of what I offer, my suggestion would be to sign up for my newsletter. If you go to my
I'm going to post that in a few minutes, Ellie.
Oh, okay. Homepage, you scroll down. So that
Yeah.
would be the way to kind of be aware of what's going on and when different things are launching.
Yeah, I'm going to post all of that here before we're done.
Okay.
And I'm going to add something here that you're not being entirely, what's the word, open with what's really going on here.
No,
I've known Dr. Stein many years, and so I'm just going to disclose that part of the reason that she's closing her practice is because she wants to get back to living some of her life that she hasn't been able to do for a long time, partially because she was so sick. But because she is so much better today, after having practiced these techniques for so long, she is now able to go out and do these things.
that's true.
That's
I
true.
have to say, though, the flights to Antarctica and back are quite daunting. So we'll, talk to me in March and we'll see how well I did.
Yes, but Ellie, the point is you couldn't have done this 10 years ago.
That's true.
That's true. Yeah, minor detail. Let's just, yeah.
I see a question that I'm dying to answer.
Go ahead.
Is this similar to the work of Dr. John Sarno? So my clear answer is absolutely not. So I kept hearing about him and I bought 2 of his books. I made it through the first book and I couldn't stomach the second one. I put it in the Goodwill bin. So Dr. Sarno believes that all pain is due to repressed emotion. I absolutely disagree. The science shows that absolutely emotion is a factor. I've talked about how mood and pain are processed in the same areas of the brain. So if you're very anxious or very depressed, and this is like super clear science, pain perception goes up. But I have many patients who are, from a mental health perspective, incredibly healthy people, and they have excruciating chronic pain. And I do not believe, I'm sure there are people for whom trauma and repressed emotion are relevant. I've had a couple people in my neuroplasticity groups who, when they get to a certain point, recognize that they have issues they want to deal with, and they go seek therapy, and then the two together really benefits them. But there are many people who have done incredibly well, have gotten rid of their pain, and it hasn't been due to repressed emotion. So in my course, I have, there's 9 sessions or kind of modules, and within each of those are kind of subtopics. And I hinted at what some of those topics are, like those booster strategies. Each one of those has its own module in the course. And I have a module on mood and pain, but I don't talk about repressed emotion. And I'm a psychiatrist, so take that as you will.
Great answer. So last question here, and then I think we can call
wrap
it.
up.
Without knowing how much you know about Joe Dispenza, he's out there, he teaches lots of stuff. How much do you know about him, and how would you compare what you do with what he does?
I know a lot
Can
about
you?
him. I've done a couple of his courses. I'm actually going to a conference in a few weeks at which he will be the guest speaker. So I'm going to be angling for a selfie with him. I respect him a lot. He bases, gotta be kind of careful. He bases what he does on science. So it was from him that I heard about some of these mindset studies. But because he doesn't tell us who did the study or what the papers are, I always find it hard to be sure if everything he's presenting is kind of the full truth. And he has a little bit of, I'm not going to say it in a negative way, but a little bit of a cult following. Like, he literally lays hands on people and they get up from their wheelchair, right? If you look at his testimonials. So that I would say he's got a good science base. He's well-intentioned. I think many of his programs and strategies are very helpful. I think for me as a conservative scientist, he goes a little bit close to the edge, but that's my personal opinion.
Okay.
So Michael, you're going to put the link to the newsletter in the chat, because that's really the best way to keep up with, like, go to my website, learn more about the course. I publish, like, a lot of stuff on my website is free. When new research comes out, I write blogs on it, for example, to try to kind of educate. That's the core of what I do.
I'm actually going to do this.
Oh, look at that.
Look at that.
Look at that. So those are all different links that might be helpful. Thank you so much for showing up and for such great questions. You can reach me through my website if you have further questions. I'd be happy to take them. And maybe I'll see you in the future when I start bringing more things online. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for being here, everybody. Thanks for being here, Eleanor, and taking
You're
us
welcome.
through.
And thanks for the opportunity, Stephen. I appreciate it.
Yeah, maybe you'll come back another time.
We'll see. If I get invited, I'm happy to do so.